The morning sun cast long shadows across the Norfolk Naval Base pier as hundreds of guests began arriving for the commissioning ceremony of the USS Freedom, the Navy's newest guided missile destroyer. The event was one of the most prestigious naval ceremonies of the year, attended by high-ranking officials, decorated veterans, and distinguished civilians from across the country. Lieutenant Commander James Harrison stood at attention near the main boarding ramp, his crisp white uniform gleaming in the sunlight. At 35, Harrison was the epitome of military precision, every ribbon and insignia perfectly aligned on his chest. He had been personally selected to oversee guest boarding procedures, a responsibility he took with utmost seriousness. The guest list had been meticulously reviewed, security clearances verified, and identification protocols established. Harrison's sharp eyes scanned each approaching guest, cross-referencing faces with the official photographs in his tablet. Senators, admirals, Medal of Honor recipients, and defense contractors moved through his checkpoint with practiced ease. Each interaction was brief, professional, and efficient. The lieutenant commander prided himself on running a tight operation. Around 10:30 in the morning, as the ceremony drew closer, Harrison noticed an elderly man approaching the checkpoint. The stranger appeared to be in his 70s, walking with a slight limp that suggested old injuries. His gray hair was neatly combed, and he wore a simple black suit that had seen better days. What caught Harrison's attention immediately was the faded military patch sewn onto the man's jacket pocket. From a distance, Harrison couldn't make out the details, but something about the man's bearings suggested military background. The elderly gentleman, whose name was Robert Bobby Chen, had driven 12 hours from his small apartment in Ohio to attend this ceremony. Bobby had received an invitation through a veterans organization, though the details of how his name had appeared on the guest list remained unclear to him. He carried with him a worn envelope containing his invitation and a photocopy of his discharge papers, documents he had carefully preserved for over 50 years. As Bobby approached the checkpoint, Harrison held up his hand in a stopping gesture. "Sir, I'll need to see your invitation and identification," he said in his official tone, his eyes already scanning Bobby's appearance with professional skepticism. Bobby reached into his jacket pocket with slightly trembling hands, the result of age rather than nervousness. He had attended military ceremonies before and understood the protocols. "Of course, young man," he replied, his voice carrying a slight accent that hinted at his Chinese-American heritage. He handed over his documents with the patience that comes from decades of dealing with military bureaucracy. Harrison examined the invitation carefully, his brow furrowing as he studied the paperwork. The invitation appeared legitimate, but something about it troubled him. The format was slightly different from the standard invitations he had been processing all morning. The paper quality seemed inconsistent with the official stationery used for other guests. "Sir, this invitation appears to be irregular," Harrison announced, his voice carrying authority but not unkindness. "I'm going to need you to step aside while I verify your credentials with the administration office." Bobby's face showed mild confusion but no anger. He had encountered similar situations throughout his life, particularly in his younger years, when discrimination was more openly practiced. "Is there a problem with my paperwork?" He asked quietly, maintaining his dignity despite the awkward situation. "The format doesn't match our standard protocol," Harrison explained, though his tone suggested he was already reaching a conclusion. "These invitations are reserved for distinguished guests and verified veterans with specific service records. I'm not seeing the proper security clearance codes." Other guests began to notice the delay, forming a small bottleneck behind Bobby. A retired general and his wife exchanged glances, and a young Marine captain shifted uncomfortably as he witnessed the interaction. The morning that had begun so smoothly was developing its first complication. Bobby stepped aside as instructed, standing near a rope barrier while Harrison made several phone calls. The elderly man watched as other guests continued boarding, some glancing his way with curiosity or sympathy. He checked his watch, noting that the ceremony would begin in less than an hour. 20 minutes passed before Harrison approached Bobby again, this time accompanied by a security officer. "Sir, I've been unable to verify your credentials through normal channels," Harrison announced. "The administration office has no record of your invitation being processed through official networks. But I have my discharge papers right here," Bobby offered, reaching for additional documentation in his jacket. "I served in the Navy for 22 years. I was stationed on 3 different ships during my career. I made." Harrison glanced at the offered papers, but didn't reach for them. "Sir, with respect, discharge papers can be easily forged, and your invitation doesn't follow proper security protocols. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises." The words hit Bobby like a physical blow. He had driven through the night, used his limited savings for gas and hotel costs, and dressed in his best suit for this ceremony. More importantly, he had looked forward to honoring the Navy that had given his life structure and purpose during his younger years. "Young man, I understand you're doing your job," Bobby said with remarkable composure. "But I assure you my service record is genuine. Perhaps there's someone else you could contact?" Harrison's patience was wearing thin. The ceremony was approaching, and he had other responsibilities to manage. "Sir, security protocols exist for a reason. Without proper verification, I cannot allow access to this vessel. I'm going to have to insist that you leave immediately." The crowd around the checkpoint had grown larger, and whispered conversations began among the waiting guests. A retired colonel approached Harrison with concern. "Lieutenant Commander? Is there a problem here?" "Nothing I can't handle, Colonel," Harrison replied curtly. "Just following standard security procedures." Bobby looked around at the faces surrounding him, some sympathetic, others merely curious about the delay. He felt the weight of his 73 years and the long journey that had brought him to this moment. His service to his country suddenly felt very distant and unappreciated. "I'll leave if you insist," Bobby said finally, his voice steady despite his disappointment. "But I want you to know that I served this country with pride, and I earned the right to be here today." As Bobby turned to walk away, his slight limp more pronounced now under the stress of the situation, several guests watched with obvious discomfort. The morning sunshine that had seemed so promising earlier now felt harsh and unforgiving. Harrison watched the elderly man retreat, feeling a mixture of professional satisfaction and nagging doubt. He had followed protocols exactly as prescribed, but something about the interaction left him unsettled. The man's dignity in the face of rejection had been remarkable, and his knowledge of naval terminology had seemed genuine. Unknown to both Harrison and Bobby, Admiral William Patterson had been observing the interaction from the ship's deck above. The 3-star admiral, at 58 years old, was a veteran of multiple conflicts and a student of naval history. He had noticed the commotion at the checkpoint and had been watching with growing interest. What Admiral Patterson had seen from his elevated position was something that Lieutenant Commander Harrison had missed entirely. The patch on Bobby's jacket, which Harrison had noted, but not examined closely, carried significance that would have changed everything. From the Admiral's vantage point, the faded colors and distinctive design were unmistakably recognizable to someone with his background and experience. As Bobby walked slowly toward the parking area, his head held high despite his disappointment, Admiral Patterson made a decision that would transform this day from one of rejection into something entirely different. The Admiral quickly descended to the main deck, his mind racing as he considered the implications of what he had witnessed. The ceremony would begin soon. But Admiral Patterson knew that sometimes the most important moments occur away from the planned program. He had spent his career learning to recognize valor and service in all its forms, and he suspected that a grave error had just been committed at his ship's boarding ramp. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Harrison continued processing guests, but the encounter with Bobby had left him distracted. Several veteran guests asked him about the elderly man they had seen leaving, and Harrison found himself repeating his explanation about security protocols with less conviction each time. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the pier as the ceremony's start time approached. The USS Freedom stood proud and ready for her commissioning, but the events of the next few minutes would prove that some of the most important ceremonies happen not on the planned program, but in the spontaneous moments when human dignity and military honor intersect in unexpected ways. Admiral William Patterson moved swiftly through the ship's corridors, his mind focused on the patch he had glimpsed on the elderly man's jacket. After 37 years of naval service, Patterson had developed an encyclopedic knowledge of military insignia, particularly those representing the most distinguished and dangerous assignments in naval history. What he had seen from the deck above was not just any veteran's patch, it was something extraordinary. Reaching his stateroom, Patterson immediately accessed his secure computer terminal and began searching through classified naval databases. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard as he pulled up records from the Vietnam War era, specifically focusing on a highly classified naval operation that few people even knew had existed. While the Admiral conducted his urgent research, Bobby Chen sat in his aging Honda Civic in the parking lot, staring at the invitation that had brought him here. The rejection stung, but it wasn't the first time his service had been questioned or overlooked. As a Chinese American who had enlisted in 1969, Bobby had faced discrimination throughout his naval career. But he had persevered because he believed in serving his adopted country with honor. Bobby's mind drifted back to the spring of 1972, when he was a 24-year-old sonar technician, first class aboard a vessel that officially didn't exist. The mission had been so classified that even today, most details remained buried in Pentagon files. Only a handful of sailors had been selected for the operation, and fewer still had survived what became known in intelligence circles as Ghost Run Charlie. Back on the USS Freedom, Admiral Patterson's computer screen displayed classified files that made his breath catch in his throat. The database confirmed what his experienced eye had recognized from a distance. The patch on Bobby's jacket was the unofficial insignia of Operation Deep Current, one of the Navy's most dangerous and secretive missions during the Vietnam conflict. Deep Current had involved modified submarines conducting intelligence-gathering operations in North Vietnamese waters, far beyond the reach of conventional rescue, if things went wrong. The sailors selected for these missions were volunteers who understood they might never come home, and that their service might never be officially acknowledged. The operation had been so sensitive that crew members were sworn to lifetime secrecy, and their service records were heavily redacted or classified. Patterson quickly cross-referenced the name Robert Chen with the Deep Current personnel files. What he found made his hands shake slightly as he read the commendation reports. Petty Officer First Class Robert Chen had not only served on 3 separate Deep Current missions, but had distinguished himself during a catastrophic equipment failure that had saved the lives of 11 crew members. The Admiral's secure phone rang, interrupting his research. His aide informed him that the ceremony would begin in 30 minutes, and that several high-ranking officials were requesting his presence on deck. Patterson instructed his aide to delay his appearance by 15 minutes, explaining that he was dealing with an urgent security matter. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Harrison was growing increasingly uncomfortable with his earlier decision. 2 retired admirals and a Medal of Honor recipient had inquired about the elderly Asian gentleman they had seen leaving, describing him as someone who carried himself like a sailor. One admiral mentioned that the man's bearing reminded him of the old-school Navy men who had served during the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. Harrison tried to push aside his doubts, focusing instead on the remaining guests who needed processing. But the questions from respected veterans were beginning to erode his confidence. He had acted according to protocol, but protocols were designed to prevent security breaches, not to exclude legitimate veterans from honoring their service. Bobby started his car engine, preparing to begin the long drive home to Ohio. As he adjusted his rearview mirror, he caught sight of the patch on his jacket and remembered the day he had been authorized to wear it. Captain Morrison had presented the unofficial insignia to the Deep Current survivors in a secret ceremony held in a warehouse at the Norfolk base. The same base where Bobby now sat in disgrace. "Gentlemen," Captain Morrison had said to the assembled survivors, "this patch represents service that your country can never officially acknowledge, but that your Navy will never forget. Wear it with pride, but speak of it to no one who wasn't there." The patch depicted a submarine silhouette surrounded by stylized waves, with a small star in the corner representing classified operations. It looked unremarkable to most people, which was entirely intentional. Only those familiar with the deepest levels of naval special operations would recognize its true meaning. Admiral Patterson printed out the classified file summary and headed toward the main deck, his dress whites crisp in the morning air. He moved with purpose through the crowd of guests, scanning the parking area for any sign of the elderly veteran. His aide approached him with concern, noting that the ceremony was scheduled to begin momentarily. "Sir, the The Secretary of the Navy is requesting your presence for the opening remarks, the aide said urgently. In 5 minutes, Patterson replied curtly. I have something more important to handle first. The Admiral reached the parking area just as Bobby's Honda was pulling toward the exit. Patterson broke into an undignified run, something that shocked the guests who witnessed it. A 3-star admiral running across a parking lot was not something one saw every day, especially not during a formal ceremony. Sir, Patterson called out, waving his arms to get Bobby's attention. Please stop. Bobby saw the admiral in his rearview mirror and immediately pulled over, assuming he was about to face additional questioning or possibly even arrest. He turned off the engine and sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, waiting for whatever would come next. Admiral Patterson approached the driver's side window, slightly out of breath from his sprint. When Bobby rolled down the window, Patterson could see the patch clearly for the first time. Up close, there was no mistaking the faded but genuine insignia of Operation Deep Current. Sir, Patterson said, his voice carrying both respect and urgency, I need to ask you about your service record. Specifically, I need to know about your time with Deep Current. Bobby's eyes widened in surprise. Very few people knew that name, and fewer still would speak it aloud. He studied the Admiral's face, noting the sincerity and urgency in his expression. Admiral, that operation is still classified, Bobby replied carefully. I'm not supposed to discuss it with anyone. Petty Officer Chen, Patterson said, deliberately using Bobby's former rank, I have clearance for Deep Current files, and I've just reviewed your service record. I need you to come back to the ship immediately. The use of his former rank and the mention of his service record told Bobby everything he needed to know about Admiral Patterson's credentials. Only someone with the highest security clearances would have access to those files. Admiral, your lieutenant commander made it clear that I'm not welcome at the ceremony, Bobby said, his voice carrying the hurt he had been trying to suppress. Patterson's jaw tightened as he considered the magnitude of the error that had been committed. Petty Officer Chen, you are not just welcome at this ceremony, you should be sitting in the front row. Lieutenant Commander Harrison made a serious mistake, and I intend to correct it immediately. Bobby studied the Admiral's face, seeing genuine respect and something that might have been shame for his fellow officers' actions. Admiral, I don't want to cause any trouble. I just wanted to honor the Navy and remember my shipmates who didn't make it home. Sir, you're going to do exactly that, Patterson said firmly. But first, I need to educate a young officer about the difference between following protocol and showing respect for extraordinary service. The Admiral opened Bobby's car door personally, a gesture that spoke volumes about his feelings regarding the situation. Would you please come with me, Petty Officer Chen? There are some people who need to meet you, and one officer who needs to learn something important about the men who came before him. As they walked back toward the USS Freedom, Admiral Patterson explained how he had recognized the Deep Current patch and what it represented. Bobby learned for the first time that his classified service had been documented and preserved, that his actions during the equipment failure had been officially recorded, and that his sacrifice and courage had been recognized at the highest levels of naval command. Other guests noticed the unusual sight of a 3-star admiral personally escorting the elderly man who had been turned away earlier. Whispered conversations spread through the crowd as people wondered about the dramatic reversal they were witnessing. Lieutenant Commander Harrison stood at his checkpoint, unaware that his morning was about to take a very different turn. The ceremony was beginning in minutes, and he was focused on securing the boarding area and ensuring that all protocols had been properly followed. He had no idea that Admiral Patterson was approaching with Bobby Chen, carrying a classified file that would challenge everything Harrison thought he knew about following orders versus understanding their purpose. The lesson that was about to unfold would become one of the most memorable moments in Lieutenant Commander Harrison's career, and a powerful reminder that sometimes the most important warriors come in unexpected packages. The morning sun reached its peak as Admiral Patterson and Bobby Chen approached the boarding ramp, where a young officer was about to learn that protocols serve honor, not the other way around. The ceremony would begin soon, but the real education was about to start at the checkpoint, where Bobby had been turned away just an hour earlier. Lieutenant Commander Harrison looked up from his checkpoint tablet, to see Admiral Patterson approaching with the elderly man he had turned away earlier. The sight confused and alarmed him. Three-star admirals didn't typically escort rejected guests back to boarding areas. Harrison quickly straightened his already perfect posture and prepared to explain his security procedures to his superior officer. "Admiral Patterson, sir," Harrison said, snapping to attention. "I wasn't expecting you at the checkpoint. Is there a problem with security protocols?" Admiral Patterson stopped directly in front of Harrison, his expression serious and controlled. Bobby stood slightly behind the Admiral, his weathered hands clasped behind his back in a familiar military stance that spoke of decades of ingrained discipline. "Lieutenant Commander Harrison," Patterson began, his voice carrying the weight of authority but also disappointment, "I need you to explain why you denied boarding access to Petty Officer First Class Robert Chen." Harrison's confidence wavered slightly at the use of the elderly man's rank and full name. "Sir, the guest's invitation didn't follow proper security protocols. The documentation appeared irregular, and I couldn't verify credentials through standard channels." Admiral Patterson held up the classified file he had printed from his stateroom. "Did you examine this man's service record before making your decision?" "No, sir. I followed standard protocol for suspicious documentation," Harrison replied, though his voice now carried less certainty. "Security procedures state that." "Security procedures," Patterson interrupted, "are designed to protect our honored guests and maintain operational security. They are not designed to humiliate war heroes." He opened the file and began reading from the official record. "Petty Officer First Class Robert Chen, sonar technician, 3 tours with Operation Deep Current. Commended for extraordinary valor during emergency surface operation, credited with saving 11 crew members during catastrophic equipment failure." Harrison's face grew pale as the Admiral continued reading. The names and operations were unfamiliar to him, but the tone of the official commendations made clear that he was learning about something extraordinary. "Operation Deep Current," Patterson explained, "was one of the most dangerous and classified missions in naval history. Submarine operations in enemy waters, no radio contact, no hope of rescue if things went wrong. The men who volunteered for these missions did so knowing they might disappear without a trace, and that their service might never be acknowledged." Bobby spoke quietly, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "We lost good men on those missions, Admiral. Men whose families still don't know exactly how they died, or even where." Patterson turned to Harrison, his expression stern but educational rather than punitive. "Lieutenant Commander, what you see as an irregular invitation is actually a special recognition sent to Deep Current survivors. These men earned the right to attend any naval ceremony they choose, but their service was so classified that normal veteran databases don't contain their records." Harrison looked at Bobby with new eyes, seeing not a suspicious elderly man but a warrior whose courage had been tested in ways the younger officer couldn't imagine. "Sir, I had no way of knowing." "You had every way of knowing," Patterson corrected firmly. "You had his bearing, his knowledge of naval terminology, his dignity under pressure, and most importantly, you had his patch." The Admiral pointed to the faded insignia on Bobby's jacket. "Do you know what that represents?" Harrison examined the patch closely for the first time, noting the submarine silhouette and the small star that marked classified operations. "No, sir, I don't recognize it." "That patch," Patterson said with reverence, "represents service so dangerous and so secret that it's not in any manual you've studied. The men who wear it volunteered for missions where survival was unlikely and recognition was impossible. They served in the shadows so that sailors like you could serve in the light." The crowd of guests had grown larger as word spread about the Admiral's unusual presence at the checkpoint. Several retired flag officers had gathered close enough to overhear the conversation, and their expressions showed both interest and approval of Patterson's handling of the situation. Admiral Patterson turned to Bobby, his voice softening with respect. "Petty Officer Chen, on behalf of the United States Navy, I apologize for the treatment you received here today. It was unworthy of your service and inconsistent with naval values." Bobby looked at the Admiral with surprise and gratitude. "Admiral, no apology is necessary." The Lieutenant Commander was doing his job as he understood it. "No," Patterson said firmly. His job is to protect the honor of the Navy while ensuring security. Today he failed at the first part of that mission. He turned back to Harrison. "Lieutenant Commander, what do you think would be an appropriate response to this situation?" Harrison looked between the Admiral and Bobby, understanding that this was both a test and an opportunity for redemption. "Sir, I believe I should personally escort Mr. Chen, Petty Officer Chen, to the VIP section and ensure he receives the recognition he deserves." "That's a start," Patterson agreed. "But first, I think you owe this man something more personal." Harrison stepped forward and came to attention in front of Bobby. "Petty Officer Chen, I formally apologize for my failure to recognize your service and for the disrespect I showed to a naval hero. You honor this ship with your presence, and I failed in my duty to honor you in return." Bobby studied the young officer's face, seeing genuine remorse and a lesson learned. "Lieutenant Commander, you were following your training, but remember that protocols serve people, not the other way around. The next time you encounter someone who carries themselves like a sailor, ask more questions before making assumptions." Admiral Patterson nodded approvingly. "Now, Lieutenant Commander, I want you to personally escort Petty Officer Chen to the front row of the ceremony. He'll be sitting with the other Deep Current survivors who are attending today." Harrison looked surprised. "There are others, sir?" "3 others," Patterson confirmed. "All of them received the same special invitations, and all of them have been seated with honor. Petty Officer Chen should have been with them from the beginning." As they walked toward the ship, Admiral Patterson explained more about Operation Deep Current and its significance in naval history. Bobby found himself sharing stories he had kept secret for 50 years, describing the courage of his shipmates and the challenges they had faced in the depths of the ocean. The ceremony began with Admiral Patterson taking the podium to address the assembled guests. But before beginning his prepared remarks about the USS Freedom, he made an announcement that surprised everyone present. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we commission this fine ship, I want to recognize some special guests among us today. 4 survivors of Operation Deep Current are here to honor us with their presence. These men volunteered for missions so dangerous and so classified that their heroism has never been publicly acknowledged." Patterson called Bobby and the 3 other Deep Current veterans to stand, and the crowd erupted in sustained applause. Veterans and civilians alike rose to their feet, many with tears in their eyes, as they witnessed the public recognition of service that had remained hidden for decades. Bobby stood with his fellow survivors, men he hadn't seen in years, feeling a mixture of pride, sorrow for absent friends, and gratitude that their service was finally being acknowledged. The patch on his jacket, which had nearly prevented his attendance, now served as a symbol of honor, recognized by all present. During the ceremony that followed, Lieutenant Commander Harrison found himself repeatedly glancing at Bobby and the other Deep Current veterans. The lesson he had learned about looking beyond appearances and understanding the true meaning of service would stay with him throughout his career. After the ceremony, Bobby was surrounded by admirers who wanted to hear about his service. Young sailors listened with rapt attention as he described the courage and dedication of his long-ago shipmates. The invitation that had seemed irregular to Harrison was now revealed to be one of the most meaningful honors the Navy could bestow. Admiral Patterson approached Bobby as the crowd began to disperse. "Petty Officer Chen, I hope today helps make up for the initial misunderstanding." Bobby shook the Admiral's hand firmly. "Admiral, today reminded me why I was proud to serve, and why I'm still proud to be called a sailor. Thank you for seeing what that young officer missed." "What did I miss?" came a voice behind them. Lieutenant Commander Harrison had approached. Having completed his post-ceremony duties, Bobby turned to the younger officer with a gentle smile. "You missed the fact that heroes don't always look like what you expect, and that the most important service often happens in the shadows. But you learned, and that's what matters." Harrison nodded seriously. "Sir, I've requested to review the records of all classified operations, so I'll be better prepared to recognize service like yours in the future." "That's good," Bobby said. "But more importantly, remember to look at the person, not just the paperwork. Military bearing, pride, dignity, these things can't be forged. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Norfolk Naval Base, Bobby prepared to drive back to Ohio, but this time, his journey home would be filled with memories of recognition and honor, rather than rejection and disappointment. Lieutenant Commander Harrison would go on to have a distinguished career, but he never forgot the lesson he learned the day he almost turned away a hero. He instituted new protocols at every command he served, ensuring that veteran recognition included education about classified operations and the importance of respecting service in all its forms. Admiral Patterson included the story in his leadership seminars, using it to teach young officers about the difference between following rules and understanding their purpose. The tale of Bobby Chen and his deep current patch became legendary throughout the Navy, a reminder that honor and courage sometimes come in unexpected packages. Bobby Chen returned to his small apartment in Ohio, where he carefully hung up his suit and placed his deep current patch in a place of honor. The ceremony had reminded him that his service mattered, that his sacrifices had meaning, and that the Navy he had loved and served truly was a family that never forgot its own. The USS Freedom was commissioned that day with all the pomp and ceremony the Navy could provide, but those who were present would always remember it as the day when an old sailor's dignity taught a young officer the true meaning of honor, and when a faded patch nearly overlooked became a symbol of service recognized and respected. In the years that followed, Bobby would receive regular invitations to naval ceremonies, always marked with the special recognition codes that honored classified service. He attended when he could, always wearing his patch with pride, and always remembering the day when rejection became recognition, and when the true meaning of naval brotherhood was demonstrated by an admiral who understood that protocols must serve honor, never the other way around.